Hello, I'm Paul Gates, moderator of AppTV's The Academics. On this first program of the new season, we're going to give you our views on what else, the upcoming election. Also, the increasingly confusing relationship between the United States and Russia. First, our panel. To my right, Nancy Love of Appalachian's Department of Government and Justice Studies, Michael Wade of our History Department, and a new member of the group, David Spiceland, who's migrated from AppTV's The Media and who teaches with me in the Department of Communication. Welcome, Dave.
Thanks, Paul.
Now the election. Nancy, let's have some background on the gubernatorial contest.
Sure, happy to do that. I think the interesting question here is that we don't yet know who is going to win. And the question is interesting because an incumbent has never lost the North Carolina gubernatorial race. McCrory should have a lot of things going for him. His party controls the legislature. He should be leading as an incumbent. He's made tax cuts. He has claimed responsibility for the Carolina comeback. Cooper has been helped by HB2, by McCrory's ties to Duke Energy. He's not yet as well known as he needs to be among the voters. He has a relatively quiet style. And the race is still surprisingly close, given what's working for both of the candidates.
Are we expecting a shift, something else to appear and to move the needle in one direction or the other?
Well, among the questions there is what role the presidential candidates will have in the gubernatorial and also the North Carolina Senate race, and how HB2 is going to continue to play out as increasing numbers of bans are affecting the state.
Maybe we can return to the presidential contest and how that might affect the down ballot results. How about the North Carolina Senate race? Mike?
Are you asking what the effect of the presidential contest may be on that?
Well, no, let's start with maybe the conflicting claims between the two camps, Richard Burr, and the challenger Deborah Ross.
I think it's hard to say. I think the biggest issue in this race may turn out to be Senator Burr himself. He's a low-key, well-funded supporter of business interests, but in my estimation, a person who in 2 terms has shown no long-term vision about much of anything, is not a leader in the Senate. The posts that he occupies, which he says are significant to voters in North Carolina, they may be, they may not, but they're the result of seniority, not any executive ability that he's indicated. Essentially, he's got no significant accomplishments after 2 terms. I know the issues that you're referring to are about the insurance industry and his personal wealth. I think the edge of his challenger may be that she's saying we need representation in Washington that actually does something for the people of North Carolina that goes beyond things like constituent services, that there are long-term issues that are important.
There was a report in the Winston-Salem Journal this morning about the Burr campaign, or Burr's, not his campaign, but his Senate office having his in-laws on the payroll as far as renting property for his office. And I wondered, well, not strictly illegal. I mean, this is not, apparently the payments were at market rates and so forth. But does this look bad for a candidate coming up to an election in just 30, 40 days? Maybe not quite that soon, but does it look bad for that to come out now?
It's news to me, but if it buttresses the challengers' claims about special interests.
Dave, any insight on that?
If you drive to Winston-Salem, there's a billboard, and I don't know who paid for it because I always put it in very small letters, but it's basically chiding Senator Burr in terms of, because he's a Second Amendment supporter, and it's chiding him for background checks at gun shows. Do I have that right? So there's that criticism.
For not supporting background checks.
Okay, there we go, yeah. So.
Yeah. Back to the gubernatorial race for a second, and the claims that each side, McCrory is making about Cooper's tenure as Attorney General. Is there anything to that? The crime lab issue, the poorly handled blood sample questions that centers that makes the centerpiece of one of the ads, and is that? How's this?
I know something about that because I have let's just say I know someone who was arrested and they lost the blood sample. Lord knows where it is. Maybe it's in Colorado now somewhere. I'm being facetious, but there's that issue.
One of the claims made in the ad, though, is that the governor has stripped Cooper's office of the SBI, the State Bureau of Investigation, which is true to an extent, but since we're talking about the blood samples, the crime lab, has not been stripped from his authority. Everything else has gone over to the Department of Public Safety, where the Highway Patrol and so forth is, but the crime lab has not. But that's something that the McCrory camp is shading a bit on their ads, trying to capitalize on that kind of blood sample thing.
You and I both know that in terms of the ads, Republican, Democrat, Libertarian, it's the impression. And the McCrory campaign makes Cooper look inefficient in terms of the pictures of him or whatever, and the Cooper campaign does the same thing for the governor. So a lot of it might just be in terms of the voters and the impression they get from the ads, which is a scary thought.
Mike?
I don't know anything about I do know about that billboard. I see it too. The crime lab thing reminds me of the old tactic of the best defense is a good offense. It seems true that Cooper inherited an Attorney General's office that had substantial problems, and a lot of them were in the crime lab. What's going on under his tenure, I frankly don't know. But I do get two of the state's three largest newspapers, and I don't recall this being a big issue ongoing before this particular campaign. Admitting that there are undoubtedly individual issues that have come up.
Sure, things do tend to service.
I think McCrory has, he did okay as long as he was in Charlotte, serving the interest of the banking community when Hugh McCall and relatively respectable bankers were there. It got iffier after that newer generation, the Ken Lewises and so forth, came along. He's supported he's been a loyal servant of the business community, developers. He rammed the Charlotte Coliseum through basically over the voters' objections. And Duke Energy, the state's most dangerous polluter. When he got to the governor's office, business, fine. No surprises there. What I found surprising was his support for basically right-wing fringe issues, such as privatizing education year by year with taxpayers' money. signing HB 2, which I thought just politically was a stupid thing to do. And generally supporting the dismantling of programs that serve public and civic interests. I really didn't expect that from him.
And speaking of HB2, there's no sign of repeal on the horizon. Might be a good campaign move, worried to do that, but doesn't seem that that's going to take place.
More and more like the Alamo.
Yeah. Well, let's turn to the national scene. How about Hillary and her campaign against Donald Trump? Nancy? Good.
Yeah, I'll bring it home to North Carolina for starters, which is that Hillary so far has outspent Trump in North Carolina 7-1. And Art Pope is now questioning Trump's lack of a ground game in the state, and the RNC is sending a number of new staffers to the state, and the Koch brothers are, because they're concerned about Trump's coattails in the state, putting money behind Burr's Senate race. So we have a changing dynamic in North Carolina with respect to the presidential campaign, and we'll see what happens over the next few weeks. Whether these new RNC staffers in the state are going to make a difference for the down ballot.
Well, how about that? The down ballot, does this indicate that they're putting money into the down ballot, Trump, Burr and down below? Does that indicate some concern about the top of the ticket? If they feel the money has to go to Burr and other state races, does that tell us anything about Trump's position in North Carolina?
Are you looking at me?
Well, sure, Dave.
Well, when I hear who's ahead, who's behind, and I, for instance, there was a poll today that said that Trump and Hillary were within 1 point of each, which is in the margin of error. But that's not the way we elect a president. It's on a state-by-state basis, so that's what I would look at more. And I'm really, the whole survey thing, I've been very critical of the media where they don't talk about margin of error. I think they're doing more of it now, where if it's within 2 or 3 points and the margin of error is 3%, then voila, you've got a tie statistically. Although it's all about turnout, who's going to turn out, well, in October and, early voting or whatever. But I like crosstabs. When I hear that Hillary's ahead or Trump's ahead, I would love to see crosstabs. Where is the support? Women, minorities, men, who's supporting geographically? And by the way, we are in a unique area here in the mountains because we were the forgotten counties. And it'd be interesting to see how many candidates might come our way, whether it's Asheville or whatever, but particularly Watauga County. My Tweetsie research has demonstrated that nobody really cared about us in Raleigh.
Let's put in another state issue that might have had some impact recently. The North Carolina voter ID law, recently struck down over, of course, the strenuous objections of the Republican Party. How much of a difference is that going to make? I mean, Dave, you're talking about who's doing the voting, where's the support coming from, what groups? It's largely thought that the voter ID law was all about suppressing minority voters and poor voters.
It was also about suppressing student voters, and that's one of the reasons I'm pretty sure that in this county the local board of elections pretty well followed the state board of elections. Back to the coattails thing, I think there are two dangers in this election, one for each candidate and one for each party. One is that if there is a coattail effect in Trump's case, it's likely to be negative, which is probably why the money is pouring into the other races. There may be people who simply stay home because while they don't support Hillary Clinton, they're also not enthusiastic about Donald Trump, and the lack of anything solid to say is this a reason to vote for him. Beyond, I like the way he speaks directly. That's not necessarily going to get people out to the polls. The other is people staying, for Hillary Clinton, is that people may stay home because they think she's got it. All evidence to the contrary. I don't know that it's going to have a big effect on the Senate race or the governor's race. I'd be very surprised if it had any effect on the governor's race. Maybe the Senate race.
Well, you mentioned this, Mike, the voter ID law falling in line with Republican thinking in the state, where they might be able to pick up votes statewide offices, not necessarily the presidential election. Watauga County's had some experience with this recently, not just recently, but in past elections too, with the struggle over where the polling places in the university area are going to be placed.
Yeah. Well, there is that, but the thought I keep coming back to on this whole business is that, ironically, these efforts look an awful lot like the efforts of late 19th century Democrats in North Carolina and other southern states to restrict the size of the electorate, the voters, so as to better control the outcome of the elections. We tend to forget that the poll tax worked against poor whites, and so did the literacy test. That was a late 19th century oligarchy controlled by the Democratic Party. And I think there's some eerie similarities between then and now.
And of course, you're referring to what segment of the electorate when we're talking about Watauga County and where the polling places are located?
And actually, I wasn't thinking about Watauga County so much as I was thinking about the entire state of North Carolina. But yeah, there's an entrenched interest here too. There is in most counties in North Carolina, and probably in many in the United States. John Egerton, the North Carolina writer who wrote on food and politics, talked about the small town southern rich man as a type, and he was talking about the 1930s.
Wow. Anything on the struggle that has just resolved about campus polling? We did have two in contention for being open on campus, down to one now. I mean, decision has been made. What was that about? Legends was in contention, and then of course the student union came down to the student union pulling it out. What's that about?
Get different answers from different people, but historically, higher turnout has benefited Democratic candidates, and so there's a concern about diminishing turnout by making access more difficult. That's been part of the struggle with the Board of Elections in Watauga County and also the state Board of Elections. But then to bring it specifically to the polling places, Chancellor Everett's had denied Legends as a polling place, citing its tendency to flood and the poor air quality there. It also can be difficult to navigate for voters with disabilities. And so the polling place will now be the student union, but the concern of the chair of the Board of Elections, County, was that in the primary, there had been violations of buffer zones and that the student union had a labyrinthine layout. Chancellor Everett's staff did not find those concerns to be confirmed and has stated very clearly that her decision was not partisan, that it was based on access and safety for the community.
If you believe in encouraging people to vote, it's easy as pie. The student union, at least for early voting, is going to result in more people voting, not just students, but primarily, admittedly, whereas Legends won't. Legends may actually be on voting day itself the preferable location because there's more parking, and you can access it right from 321. Yeah, I think it's a mixed bag. But if you're looking for voter turnout, Student Union's the place.
Yeah, and perhaps on voting day itself, Legends is a pretty good-sized facility. It used to be a supermarket.
Yeah.
So for a large turnout on Election Day itself, that may accommodate those people more easily. But trickling in on early voting, perhaps a smaller venue and a more convenient to parking
I would
might be
say
appropriate.
that the Student Union is to be the place on Election Day as
Yes.
well. Is that right? The university owes it to the voting public, regardless of political persuasion, to make sure that there is adequate access on Election Day.
Well, completely changing the subject. We promised we would talk about Russia, so let's do so. Dave, want to start that?
Well, there's a big difference between Russia and the Soviet Union. A lot of people don't realize. If you're talking about the action of Brezhnev and et cetera in the 60s, that was the Soviet Union, which was dominated by Russia. But the thing about Russia, I don't know how much time I've got, probably not a lot, because we could spend a lot of time talking about Russia. It's a big country. It spans, 12 time zones, something like that. It's a very diverse population ethnically. I was fortunate enough to go there in 1982 when it was the Soviet Union, and I got an eyeful. I remember I thought that they were the wave of the future. I was never a communist. I never played one television. But that was, the communist fear back in the 50s and whatnot. But when I went there, I saw a country that was striving to catch up with our technology, those kinds of things. But the mindset of Russia is they are very protective of that area. If you look at the downing of, was it 007, the Korean airliner, a lot of that pertained to these are our borders and you will not violate those. Now there's some other issues. Were they doing some subtle kind of spying or whatever, which is a possibility. But we lost a congressman, by the way, on that flight, which didn't seem to make much of a wave.
Quickly, what's the salient feature of the controversy? Syria, perhaps?
We don't like each other. We don't trust each other. Putin is a part of the old mindset. And Syria has sort of entered into part of that, that confrontation between us. But a lot of this goes back to the rise of Soviet Russia and Lenin and Stalin. There was that de-Stalinization by Khrushchev in the 1950s after Khrushchev came into control. So they took his body out of Lenin's tomb and took care of it. So yeah, it's a very complex subject.
I think.
Quick comment, Nancy.
Well, we also
Mike.
need to be concerned about the Baltic states and the possibility that Russia may invade and whether NATO will honor its obligations to its members. And Trump, to go back to the presidential race, has suggested that if he's president, he might not provide that assistance to the Baltic states. So NATO could be destabilized.
And the Ukraine is the breadbasket. I'm sorry.
Mike, we got about 30 seconds.
Okay, the Baltic states. I like that they're independent. I don't like that we have too many politicians wanting to sort of stick it to the Russians by visibly expanding NATO into those states. I think that's a mistake.
Well, clearly we could go on about all these topics for a long time, but for this week, that's our program. For the panel, I'm Paul Gates. We hope you'll join us next time.
You just don't go for a moment.
What?